Hey, my daring woman fam. I'm back with a new episode. For those of you who are first-time viewers, I'm Dr. Latasha Pinckney, and through my work, I help people better understand the experiences, beliefs, and perspectives that shape how they see themselves, others, and the world around them. Whether you're trying to better understand your own life or you're someone who helps others make sense of theirs, welcome to the channel. Now let's get into it. This week's conversation was spurred by a video I watched the other day. I don't remember exactly what it was about, but I remember the speaker talking about the different seasons we experience in life. So that got me thinking about discerning which season I'm in and what this particular season might require of me. In turn, I thought, why not do a deep dive into the many seasons of life and what each one requires so I could then share it with you. In the video, the speaker discussed four we moved through, describing them as seasons of planting or sowing, seasons of harvest, wilderness seasons, and seasons of transition. A season of planting or sowing is a time when we're putting in the work, investing our time and energy into something that we may not see the results of right away. A season of harvest is when we begin to see the fruit of some of what we've planted. We experience the results of work we've done, prayers we've prayed, or things we've been believing and waiting for. And then there are wilderness seasons. Those seasons can feel dry. They can be difficult, uncomfortable, and sometimes lonely. But throughout Scripture, we also see the wilderness as a place where God prepares, teaches, and reveals himself to his people in ways they may not have experienced otherwise. And then there are seasons of transition, those periods of life when something is changing and we're having to adjust to a reality that is becoming different from the one we've known. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, used the movement of the sun throughout the day in his depiction of the different stages we experience in life. He described the first half of life as the morning of life. These are often the years when so much of our attention is directed outward. We're building, we're establishing careers, we're raising families, we're trying to figure out who we are and where we fit in the world. But Jung believed that as we move into what he called the afternoon of life, something begins to change. The things that were required of us in the morning may not be what is required of us in the afternoon. And that got me thinking about how important it is to recognize the season you're in and what that season in particular is asking of you. Because what served you in one season may not be what you need in another. What required your attention before may no longer require it in the same way. And some of the things that were once necessary for one season may need to be released as you enter another. Ecclesiastes 3 tells us that there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. It says there's a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to be silent and a time to speak. What I love about this passage is that it shows us that different seasons call for different things. And here's the key that some people miss. You can't approach every season in the same way. There is a time when planting is appropriate, and there is a time when it isn't. There is a time to hold on to something, and there is a time to let it go. There is even a time to speak and a time to remain silent. That's why recognizing the season you're in is so important, so that you can better understand what this particular season requires of you. So how do you begin recognizing the season you're in? Well, I'm going to share some of the things that I've discovered that I believe might help. The planting season. So if you're in a season of planting, one of the first things you may have to accept is that there may not be much evidence yet that what you're doing is working. Hello? But that's the nature of planting. You put something into the ground and there's a lot of time that passes before you ever see the results of your efforts. And honestly, this is where people can become easily discouraged. You can be doing the work, you can be showing up consistently, you can be investing your time, your energy, your resources, and still not have much visible evidence that any of it is producing something. But here's the thing to remember. A lack of visible results doesn't necessarily mean nothing is happening. Galatians 6:9 tells us not to become weary in doing good, because at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we don't give up. That means there is a period between planting and seeing the fruit of what has been planted. But that's the thing about planting seasons. There is always a period of waiting. And the truth is, we don't like to wait. We want what we want when we want it. And when that doesn't happen, we might find ourselves frustrated or disappointed. So if you recognize that you're in a planting season, one of the questions you may need to ask yourself is, am I being faithful in how I'm tending to what I've planted while I wait for it to grow? Because a planting season requires something very different from a harvest season. It requires you to invest without immediately receiving something in return. It requires patience with a process that may not give you much feedback yet. And it requires enough discernment to know the difference between something that isn't working and something that simply hasn't had enough time to grow. And then there are seasons of harvest. This one sounds like the easy one, right? You've planted, you've waited, you've done the work, and now you finally get to experience some of what all that work has produced. But believe it or not, when you've spent a long time working towards something, it can be difficult to recognize when the season has shifted. You can become so accustomed to pursuing the goal, whatever it is, that you don't always realize it when you've actually reached it. You can become so accustomed to working for something that you don't quite know how to receive it once it arrives. And you can be so focused on whatever comes next that you never really stop to acknowledge what God has already allowed to grow. That takes me back to what Jung said about trying to live the afternoon of life according to the same rules that govern the morning. There are seasons for building, but there also has to be a time when you step back and appreciate what has been built. Deuteronomy 8 gives a really interesting warning about this. In it, Moses is preparing the Israelites to enter the promised land, and he tells them that they are going to eat and be satisfied. They're going to build houses and settle down. Their herds and flocks are going to grow. Their silver and gold will increase. In other words, they are about to experience some of what they had been waiting for. But Moses warns them that when that happens, they have to be careful not to forget God, who made it all possible. And what's important to note here is that most people think they only need God when things are difficult. But Scripture also warns about what can happen when things are going well. We know we need God when we're waiting for answers to prayers or for Him to open doors that only He can open. But what happens when the prayer is answered, when that opportunity comes? A harvest season still requires faithful stewardship. It requires you to recognize what you've been given. It requires gratitude without becoming entitled to what has been produced. And it requires remembering that the God who sustained you while you were planting is still the God you need when the harvest comes. Hallelujah. So if you find yourself in a harvest season, don't become so focused on producing the next thing that you overlook what God has already allowed to grow. Now, let's talk about the wilderness season. If you have even the slightest idea of what this season involves, then you can understand why it is a season that many people dread. Wilderness seasons can feel dry, difficult, uncomfortable, and sometimes lonely. Part of what makes the wilderness so difficult is that life can change in ways you didn't ask for or anticipate. What you knew before may no longer fit the reality you're living now. And the really hard part is that you don't necessarily know how long you're going to be there or what things will look like when you come out of it. So you may find yourself questioning what God is doing because where you are doesn't look anything like where you thought He was taking you. But like the other seasons, the wilderness has its purpose. Deuteronomy 8:2 tells us that God led the Israelites through the wilderness to humble and test them and reveal what was in their hearts. And before beginning His public ministry, Jesus was led into the wilderness where His identity, obedience, and faithfulness to God were tested. And when you think about it, part of the purpose of that testing is to prepare us for what comes next. Jesus was about to begin His public ministry, and in the wilderness, He was confronted with some of the very things He would continue to face. Questions around His identity, the temptation to use His power for His own purposes, and whether He would remain obedient to what God had called Him to do. In the case of Israel, they had left what was familiar in Egypt, but they had not yet entered the land that God had promised them. So they had to learn to depend on God in ways they hadn't before. And sometimes the wilderness prepares us in similar ways. There may be things you're going to have to withstand in the next season that require a different level of endurance. Or like Israel, you may have to learn to depend on God in ways that are different from what you've previously known. There may be ways of thinking that served you in one season that can't go with you into the next one. And sometimes the wilderness quiets some of the noise around you so that you can better hear what God may be saying and showing to you. So if you find yourself in a wilderness season, pay attention to what it's revealing. Don't spend unnecessary energy trying to get out of that season before it's time. Trust me, you can't. Let that season show you what needs to come out of you. Let God develop what needs to be placed in you, and allow the season to do what it was intended to do. Draw you closer to Him and prepare you for where He's taking you next. Now, this is my favorite one, but not really, but here we are. And then there's transition. A season that a former spiritual mentor of mine once referred to as hell in the hallways. I've talked about transition on this channel before. In fact, I've shared several messages about it over the years. And as I've been thinking about transition again, I've realized there is so much more to it than simply moving from one season of life into the next. Some transitions are easier to navigate because you have some idea of what you're moving toward. There may still be some uncertainty and adjustment involved, but at least you have a sense of what you're transitioning into. But then there are those transitions when you can't see what's on the other side. You're in that hallway. My former spiritual advisor was talking about somewhere between what was and whatever comes next. And sometimes you can spend a lot longer there than you expected. And I know some of this may sound similar to what I just described as a wilderness season, and there can certainly be some overlap. In fact, the wilderness itself can be a place of transition. We see that with the Israelites. They had left Egypt, but spent 40 years in the wilderness before they entered the promised land. But not every transition is a wilderness season. Sometimes you're just simply adjusting to the fact that your life has changed. Maybe your children are beginning to leave home, and so much of your life has been organized around raising them. You've spent years preparing them for this, and this is exactly what they're supposed to do. But it also means that your life as you knew it is no longer the same. And now you're having to figure out what life looks like in this new season. Or maybe you've spent years working towards something, and somewhere along the way, you realize the work you've been doing no longer fits where you are. You know something needs to change, but knowing that doesn't necessarily mean you know what comes next. So for a while, you're still showing up and doing what you've always done, while internally knowing that something has shifted. I've personally been in a season of transition for the past few years now. And for me, that transition has shown up in several different ways. Some of it has been emotional, as I've adjusted to changing family dynamics, my children getting older and beginning to leave home. And some of it has been physical. Now that I'm in midlife, some of the things and strategies that used to work for my body just don't work in the same way anymore. And what I found is that I have to be much more intentional about what I eat, how I exercise, and how I take care of myself. So there's been a lot of adjusting to what life looks like for me now, and it's very different from the life that I once knew. I think one of the things that can make this kind of change so difficult is not always knowing what life looks like on the other side. Most of us want some degree of certainty about our lives. We want to know what's coming next. We want to know what we're working toward and where all of this is leading. Because when we have some idea of what comes next, we can make plans, we can prepare, we can make decisions about what we need to do. But seasons of transition don't always give us that. And when you've been in that in-between place for a long time, it can begin to feel like God has forgotten about you, especially when you've been praying, believing, and hoping for something in particular. You thought that door would have opened by now. You thought the answer you were looking for would have come by now. You thought that by this point, you would have some idea of where all the work you'd put into what you were hoping for was leading. But there comes a point when you have to trust that whatever the outcome is, And wherever this season eventually leads you, God's got you. I think what this season teaches us is how to remain present in the life you have while you're waiting for clarity about what comes next. Can you continue living? Can you continue trusting God? And remember that just because you can't see what's next doesn't mean that He's forgotten you. The truth about each of these seasons is that we will go through every single one of them at various stages in our lives, whether we like it or not. And oftentimes we have no idea how long each season will last. But the good thing we can take away from here, I hope, is that life isn't always going to require the same level of effort from us or require us to adjust in the same ways we have before. Sometimes what we're being asked to do is slow down and enter a period of rest. Seasons when the planting has ended and things in your life may have steadied. But the challenge is that we don't always recognize when we enter this season, especially when you've become accustomed to always having something you're working toward, or you still believe you're being asked to respond to the demands of a previous season. The thing is, though, there are times when a season isn't asking you to do more. Instead, it is giving you an opportunity to slow down, recover, and rest. And that's why discerning the season you're in matters. Because what if some of the frustration we experience comes from expecting one season to give us what belongs to another? What if we're looking for a harvest when we're still being asked to plant? What if we're trying to plant something new when this is actually a season to receive and steward what has already grown? What if we're trying to rush our way out of a wilderness that still has something to teach us? What if we're trying to force an answer in a season of transition when for now we're being asked to wait? Or what if we're continuing to fill our lives with more to do when this is actually a season to rest? So as you think about where you are in your life right now, consider what this season is asking of you and whether the way you're responding reflects the season you're actually in. That's all I have for now. I do hope this gave you a way to better understand the season you're in so that you know how to move accordingly. Until next time, keep reflecting, keep growing, and remember, sometimes the most powerful shifts in perspective begin with a single question.